Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service on this Tuesday, May 23rd, 2023. And I have additional sources of information if you would like to go to weather.gov. That is the National Weather Service's online presence. It brings you to a map of the continental U.S. with Alaska and Hawaii to the lower left. You can also get info for American Samoa, as well as Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. On the continental U.S. map this Tuesday afternoon, we have air quality alerts for southern Minnesota, much of Wisconsin. Flood watch continues across the Florida Panhandle, far southwest Georgia. Severe thunderstorm watch in effect West Texas along northeastern New Mexico, and flood watches in the northeastern corner of Nevada. Across Alaska, though, the Yukon and Kobuk rivers we're keeping a close eye on because we have still the threat of ice jam and snowmelt flooding. Some of that is actually occurring, and water levels are going to remain very high across the state just about anywhere because we're now getting the bulk of the runoff coming from snowmelt. So snowmelt, the transition is beginning to happen from ice jam to snowmelt flooding, especially in the upper reaches of the river systems. A cold front, a late season cold front, will be bringing in some snowfall to areas of the Brooks Range above 2,000 feet. 3-4 inches of snow could fall late this Tuesday night through early Thursday morning. And yet another North Pacific low is going to rotate up into the Gulf on Thursday, bringing more inclement weather along areas there of the Gulf Coast and especially through the western Gulf Coast. Still looks like we're going to see below normal temperatures centered on the southern mainland into early June, so no big warm-ups coming here for at least the next 10 to 14 days. Looking at the FAA webcams this afternoon, Wainwright, we've had a cold front move through there. Wind shifted to the north. Temperature is just below freezing. There's low overcast and could be some snow showers also pass through following that passage of the front. Further south, as we get up toward the Yukon Flats, Beaver, high water on the Yukon. You can see it there. We have flood warnings in effect on the Yukon River at Fort Yukon and Stevens Village in the upper portion of the Yukon River due to all this high water from excessive snowmelt runoff. And then down, way down the Yukon River, Imanak, there is mostly cloudy, 45 degrees. The concern about the lower region of the Yukon River is there's still ice on the river, so there's that potential for ice jam flooding. A flood warning is in effect still at Russian Mission, and the areas downstream are under a flood watch because in that area of the lower Yukon, there's the potential for ice jam flooding still. Kodiak, seeing a moderate rain and fog, 45 degrees. We've had some pretty strong winds through Shelikof Strait, gusting 45 to near 60 miles an hour in places. So here on the broader hazardous map, we have the three flood watches on the upper lower Yukon River and there on the Kobuk River system. And as I like this map here, it kind of shows it better. This blue area here is the flood watch for snowmelt flooding. Flood watch here for ice jam, snowmelt flooding as well. And downstream here in the lower Yukon Delta, that is a flood watch for the potential for ice jam flooding. We still have flood warnings at Fort Yukon and over at Stevens Village due to very high water from the excessive snowmelt runoff. We have flood advisories for the area Kobuk downstream through Ambler. We still have flood advisories on the Yukon, Middle Yukon River, Ruby, Galena, and to Kaltag. And then further south and west, we have Russian Mission still under a flood warning for ice jam flooding, and then the area below, all the small communities going downstream from there to the mouth of the Yukon under flood watches. And this is an area we're going to be keeping a very close eye on there for some ice jam flooding. Fire danger still very high here up across the Yukon Flats, but fire danger should be coming down here going into Memorial Day weekend. Cold front's going to press further south and east and then stall out across this region, but there will be some showers along that front to dampen things, and temperatures are going to cool This afternoon, readings have been in the lower 70s, and so it's been rather warm there, but at least not windy. On the satellite imagery, we have the one low pressure circulation there just southeast of Kodiak Island. Another low is going to come up out of the North Pacific on Thursday and then hook back toward the western Gulf. We have cold front now that's pushed in to the western North Slope, and that'll continue to work its way southeastward before stalling out later tomorrow and early Thursday. And behind me, there is yet another system that'll be entering in through the western and central Aleutians. But by the time we get to late tonight and early on Wednesday morning, we have the one low sitting here just southwest of Kodiak Island and a couple of other low centers back up toward the Yukon Delta and then up here in the central interior. And there's that cold front. And with it, we do expect there could be some accumulating snow, an inch or two along areas of the North Slope and the passes there of the Brooks Range. But above 2,000 feet, some areas could see as much as 4 inches of snow through early on Thursday morning. And here's the next low out here toward the Aleutians and Lower Bering. And by the time we get to Thursday, that system will be working its way eastward. But then the other low that comes up out of the North Pacific kind of hooks back toward just outside of Cook Inlet in through the western Gulf. And this is going to bring some moderate to locally heavier rain along areas of the northern northeastern Gulf Coast. The cold front in the north kind of stalls out with some showers, rain showers south of it, but along the spine of the Brooks Range into the North Slope and the Canadian Arctic coast, it'll be in the form of some snow. Looking at the low temperature map for Wednesday morning, most areas are going to stay above 40 degrees for lows. If you do get a little clearing, you could dip into the upper 30s, especially Copper River Basin. It'd be a bit colder with any sort of clearing, but otherwise, temperatures could get back up at least mid-60s, southern Panhandle, Craig on over toward Ketchikan, even low 60s, Juneau and Haines. Still on the cool side here, south central. This is the region that's going to see below normal temperatures the rest of this month into at least the first few days of June. Low temperatures Thursday morning, again, generally above 40 in the 40s across the region. And then Thursday afternoon, we expect temperatures still to be back up mid-60s, the southern Panhandle lower, maybe a few mid-60s from Wrangell on up toward Skagway. We could see 63 at Glen Allen, but again, struggle to get near 60 in the vicinity of Anchorage, and we do anticipate there could be a few rain showers there around Thursday during the daytime. Here along the Yukon River, temperatures stay well above freezing overnight, so that's facilitating the snow melt in the higher elevations around the Yukon River. To the north, it cools back down with readings into the 20s, and as we go into Wednesday afternoon, a pretty strong temperature contrast where that front slips just south of the spine of the Brooks Range. South of the front, 72 degrees at Fort Yukon for Wednesday afternoon, but behind it, some 30 and 40 degrees cooler back up here along the northwestern and the Arctic coast. For Thursday morning, lows stay above freezing there again in the 40s across the Yukon Valley, but back to the north and west, temperatures get below freezing into the 20s from the spine of the Brooks Range through the North Slope and Arctic coast, even back toward the northern Seward Peninsula, Wales, and Shishmaref. But as we look into Thursday afternoon, temperatures a few degrees cooler, and we can start to see some scattered showers breaking out in this area. And as we would expect, the water levels are going to stay high going into the holiday weekend for much of the interior. Here across the lower portions of the Yukon Delta, temperatures will stay above freezing tonight. Temperatures in the 50s as you get up toward Anvik and near 60 even at McGrath, 40s along the Aleutians. And then for Thursday morning, we expect still lows to stay in the 30s along the southwest coast. Thursday afternoon, generally in the 40s along the lower Yukon Delta. And the temperature outlook here, May 29th to June 2nd, the coldest temperatures below normal across the southern portion of the state, especially centered on the southwest and Cook Inlet, and then maybe a little above normal precipitation in east central areas.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Here's your aviation weather. If you have a flight planned this midweek, Wednesday or Thursday, low pressure continues to sit just south of Kodiak Island, and there's going to be another impulse low that comes up out of the North Pacific and then rotates back toward the Western Gulf just off of Kodiak Island as we get into Thursday. Widespread IFR conditions across the Gulf and the western Gulf Coast there. Also along areas of the southwest coast, and in the far north, cold front is going to push slowly south-southeastward across the Brooks Range, and especially behind it in some areas of snow. We expect IFR conditions, lower ceilings, and then way out to the west, there's yet another low pressure way out western Bering that's going to have another low develop and kind of form along a triple point and work its way up through the lower half of the Bering Sea. Wednesday afternoon, IFR conditions along areas of the Arctic coast, and some lower ceilings and some snow there. Along the Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound through the northeastern Gulf Coast to off of the Panhandle. We expect IFR conditions. A frontal system lifts its way northeastward. IFR out over the Bering Sea from the Bering Strait, off of the Yukon Delta, all the way back toward the central Aleutians. And for Thursday morning, we see rather widespread IFR conditions along areas of the North Slope and the spine of the Brooks Range, where there certainly could be some snowfall in some of the passes there going up through the Brooks Range, and then down here along areas of the northern Panhandle, northeastern Gulf Coast, as well as much of the Bering Sea, especially off of, say, Bristol Bay, off of the Yukon Delta up through St. Lawrence Island and down through St. Matthew, St. Paul, and in through the central eastern Aleutians. Thursday afternoon, some improvement in the at least interior MVFR prevalent across much of the Gulf and Gulf Coast, southwest, and then a broad area of IFR conditions there through the central Bering. And looking at pass conditions, Anaktuvik Pass will start out IFR on Wednesday as the result of that frontal system moving into the region, becoming MVFR in the afternoon. Adigan Pass, IFR early, becoming MVFR. Lake Clark may start out IFR, becoming MVFR, and we expect MVFR conditions as we go further up along the west side and central Alaska Range. Rainy Pass as well as Windy Pass eastward through Isabel Pass will be MVFR. Mentasta may see a little VFR conditions by afternoon, especially the northern half of the pass. Further south, if you're flying south, Copper River Basin, MVFR conditions should prevail. Tanita Pass, MVFR trying to give way to VFR by afternoon. And further south, we have Portage Pass IFR, and that IFR will tend to hold along the east entrance in Prince William Sound, with MVFR being dominant midway through the pass and out through the west entrance. Finally, Chilkoot and White starts out with a VFR very early, but we'll see IFR conditions moving in as we go through the afternoon. Freezing levels aloft are highest out through central Canada, above 8,000 feet, still above 6,000 feet here through the Yukon Flats, upper Yukon Valley. And then we find them falling off. Coolest pocket of air down here across the eastern Aleutians, below 2,000 feet, associated just with a cooler pocket of air. We have low pressure with the frontal system out arcing into the Gulf, with freezing levels aloft bumping up to 6, 8, and 10,000 feet there. Greatest threat for icing, we could see some moderate icing along areas of the Alaska Peninsula and perhaps there east of Prince William Sound in the northwestern Gulf above 8,000 feet. Some scattered showers in through the interior, generally above 6,000 feet, and then associated with that cold front, any light rain, snow showers above 6,000 feet, and then back here to the west, the frontal system, low pressure area we expect on the backside above 6,000 feet, but ahead of it, milder air above 10,000 feet in the central Aleutians. Here are the jet stream level winds. We have a low circulation rate centered on the Alaska Peninsula with 125 jet max out ahead of it, and behind it 155 knot jet max in the vicinity of the far western Aleutians. At 700 millibars, that low circulation remains just southwest of Kodiak Island back toward the far western Aleutians, and then 3,000 feet, the strongest winds are actually moving through areas of the central Aleutians. We expect, as a result, considerable moderate turbulence from areas of the northwestern Gulf around Prince William Sound down toward the entrance of Cook Inlet, and then especially as we trail out along the Alaska Peninsula and back through the eastern and central Aleutians, surface to 4,000 feet.
So that Galena flood back in 2013 was at the intersection of weather and climate. Rick, I often get questions about the difference between weather and climate. How do you distinguish between the two?
Well, that's a really good question, John. One of the analogies that I like to use, the wardrobe analogy. So in my closet, in my dresser, I've got clothes appropriate for 90-degree weather and 50 below weather. That's the climate part of my wardrobe. But what I'm going to put on today, am I going to wear my Hawaiian shirt because it's going to be a hot July day, or am I going to wear my bunny boots because it's going to be 50 below? That's the weather part of my wardrobe.
You know, there's another interesting analogy. I've heard it said that climate is like your personality, whereas weather is like the mood you're in today. It's like that old John Denver song. Some days are diamonds and some days are stones. That's how weather works.
Of course, it's really a continuous range. Just as the Galena ice jam flooding was a result of a weather event, that ice jam, up against that cold spring, a climate event. So too with less impactful events. For instance, a daily record high temperature is a weather event, one day's high. But we put that in a climate context, say comparing to a century or more of individual temperatures on a given date.
So these extreme events like record high temperatures also happen on the seasonal time scale. Just in the last few years, we've had what was called a marine heat wave in the waters south of Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. The water temperatures in that area set new records in 2015 and 2016.
And most Alaskans are acutely aware that big wildfire seasons are becoming more and more common, most recently in 2015, and the frequency of million-acre seasons has doubled since the early 1990s.
Just this past winter, we had another event in the Bering Sea. The ice extent in the Bering was lower than it had ever been in the last 150 years. That's about as far back as the good records go. There'd never been another year like this one in the Bering with so little sea ice. That had major impacts on the communities along the west coast and the northwest coast.
So, John, what have you been hearing from folks around town about these kind of climate extremes?
I've heard from a number of people who've been here a long time that winters just aren't what they used to be. The average temperatures are higher than they were back in the 1960s and 1970s, and we just don't get the extreme cold days, the days down in the minus 50s or even the minus 60s that we used to experience in Fairbanks back in the, say, the 1960s, 1970s, and even into the 1980s.
Well, and it's not just winter either. 2016 and 2017, the summers brought unusually muggy, humid weather to Fairbanks. We're not used to thinking of that in interior Alaska, but record high humidities during the summer months. As in the winter, we've had a significant increase in freezing rain events, since about 2000. So much so that DOT has changed their road treatment strategy, and now we have the school district building in winter rain days into the calendar. And of course, we all need good weather forecasts for these high impact weather events.
But we know, though, that weather forecasts are sometimes wrong just 3 or 4 days in advance. So if these weather forecasts and the models they're based on can't pick up events like freezing rain 3 or 4 days ahead, how can we believe what they say about climate for the future?
Well, that's a really good question, John. And I think the important thing to remember is that parts of the system are predictable.
So climate models can't give you weather for particular days or even for particular months or years. They actually predict averages. These are averages over periods of a decade or two, or even averages over periods of several years. So they don't give us the month-to-month information that we might want. What are they telling us about the future, though?
Well, these climate models are telling us on the decades-long time frames that warmer winters are going to become more common. We're going to have more frequent, very low sea ice years with late freeze up and early melt out. And the same will be true on Alaskan rivers. We'll have more frequent seasons when freeze up is late and break up is early.
One of the other common threads in these climate model predictions is that heavy rain events and heavy snow events will become more common in the future. That's actually a prediction that the models make for mid-latitudes as well as for high latitudes in areas like Alaska. So we can expect the heavy downpours to become heavier and the heavy winter snows to become heavier than we've been used to. They're also predicting more frequent freezing rain events, getting back to what you talked about earlier. These events that might have happened just once every year or two in the past could actually end up happening several times in a winter in the future, according to the climate models.
And it is important to remember that even in a warming world, there are still going to be seasons and years that are colder than the average, but these cold seasons will become less and less common. So, John, maybe I don't need to have those bunny boots in my closet anymore?
Well, at least you won't need to wear them as often as you did in the past.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back, and let's start our marine weather segment as we usually do with the sea ice edge. And the ice, we start to see the openings increasing along the northwestern coast off of Point Lay and down through the Bering Strait, especially in through areas of Norton Sound and surrounding the northwest and south sides of St. Lawrence Island. Pack ice out over the north central Bering and surrounding St. Matthew is also beginning to melt off and shrink back. We still have some shore-fast ice in the lower Yukon Delta, and that's a concern because we have still a lot of water pushing down through the middle and lower portion of the Yukon River, and this could help block some of the ice from flowing out into the sea there, but hopefully that won't become a major problem. But it is something the River Forecast Center is monitoring closely. As for the marine forecast for the inner channels of the Panhandle, relatively light winds, 5 to 10 knots, southerly Lynn Canal waves generally a couple of feet, winds turn northwesterly and get south there of Stevens Passage in through Ketchikan. And then the outer coast, generally from Craig, off of Craig up through off of Gustavus, look for south-southeast winds around 10 to 15 knots. They pick up a bit more easterly, 20 to 25 knots once you get west of Yakutat Bay. And then on Thursday, mixed bag of winds again in through the inner channels, relatively light, 10 knots northwest in Lynn Canal, south-southeast up through Dixon Entrance and up into Stevens Passage. And then the outer coast, look for south winds off of Craig, turning southeasterly, Sitka on up through Gustavus, and then more easterly and picking up to 35 to 40 knot gales there just outside of Yakutat Bay. Waves generally running 4, but as high as 7 to 8 feet there outside of Yakutat. And for the northwestern Gulf, outside of the Kenai Peninsula, we are looking at east-northeast winds 25 knots. East winds within Prince William Sound 15 knots, waves a few feet. Down the length of Cook Inlet, winds will be north to northeast 15 to 20 knots with waves 3 feet up on the north end and as much as 5 to 7 feet at the mouth of Cook Entrance there. And then on Thursday, winds continue generally with a northeasterly component as high as 30-40 knots here in the north central Gulf to off of the Kenai. 20 knot easterly winds, 3-4 foot waves within Prince William Sound. But as we drop down, look for for northeast to north winds through upper and middle Cook Inlet, and then variable winds there around the entrance with waves there of 3 to 4 feet. Across Kodiak Island, winds, we have a remnant area of low pressure circulation, this kind of in this region. Southwest winds on the east side of Kodiak Island, northeast winds down through Shelikof Strait, and then in the wake of this system, winds turn more westerly around 20 knots, waves generally 4 to 6 feet on the North Pacific side, 2 to 4 feet on the Bering side. Winds will come down further on Thursday around 10 to 15 knots in the vicinity of Kodiak Island, more variable either side of the Middle Peninsula, and then southeasterly 20 knots as yet another frontal system will be approaching from the eastern Aleutians, and waves generally 2 to 4 feet on the Bering side and 3 to 5 feet on the North Pacific side. West winds in the eastern Aleutians on Wednesday will become more variable because we do have this frontal system that's going to work its way eastward. Winds do, though, pick up as high as 30 knots through the central Aleutians up past west of Adak, and then by the time we get into Thursday, you can see the frontal system clearly entering through the eastern Aleutians, south winds ahead of it, then they shift back to the west at about 20 to 25 knots through the central and western Aleutians, waves 8 to 11 feet on the North Pacific side and picking up to 6 to 8 feet once you get through the central Aleutians on Bering side. And then across areas of the southwest coast, north winds, Norton Sound off the Yukon Delta, St. Matthew, turning more west-northwest from Bristol Bay towards St. Paul, variable winds at 10 knots there within Bristol Bay, and then lighter winds along the coast, generally near 10 knots from Norton Sound down through the YK Delta and Bristol Bay, but look for northeast to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots there at St. Paul, St. George with waves as high as 8 feet, and along the Arctic coast, northeast winds pick up in the wake, the cold front that continues to push further south and eastward across the interior. Winds through the lower Chukchi Sea northeast to north 20 to as high as 30 knots off of Cape Lisburne, turning northerly 25 knots through the Bering Strait. Look for east-northeast winds 15 to 20 knots along the Arctic coast, as high as 30 knots off of Cape Lisburne, and northeast winds around 15 knots through the Bering Strait to St. Lawrence.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.